This is Inside the Commission, a Gambling Commission podcast. Welcome to Inside the Commission, a podcast all about gambling in Great Britain. Here we'll cover all the latest topics and trends from across the gambling sector and discuss the big issues that matter to you. From consumer queries to industry insights, we'll bring you the facts from the front line of regulation and share the stats and stories from those in the know. For all the latest discussions and updates, you can subscribe to our Gambling Commission YouTube channel, or you can find us on your preferred platform, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Welcome to the second part of this episode, looking at research into teenage boys and young men's experiences of gambling. That's right, this is the second part of the episode, so as we go straight back into a conversation with George and Lauren, we would strenuously advise you to listen to part one first. If you don't, you'll miss a lot of context and explainers, and we wouldn't want that. Now over to Haroon as we continue with some of the findings from the report and what this means for future research projects conducted by the Gambling Commission. This is Inside the Commission, a Gambling Commission podcast.
I suppose that leads on to the question around so the opportunities to educate young people, I suppose, around some of this stuff. I know there's a lot of things that you can throw into the ring: parents, schools, government or authorities, operators, social media companies. Everyone's got some stake in the game, haven't they? And young people themselves, we have some of their own sort of thoughts on that. I don't know what sort of came through, if anything came through on that in terms of, of course, it's not where the buck stops, but I suppose it is kind of like, how do we make some changes here? How can we sort of educate people a little bit better so they're sort of more aware of where the potential journey goes?
Yeah, certainly. I'm very happy to kind of get the ball rolling on that one. So I think that's probably worth saying we very intentionally wanted to create time and space in our discussions for participants to really articulate their views on this, given they're at the centre of this conversation, and we want their voices to, at some level, help shape conversations around policy, around regulation, around education, protection. Also worth saying, of course, that and I think, of course, Lauren can speak to this in more detail, but where we were exploring opportunities with these participants, many that we landed on, and I can kind of touch on as well, may well fall outside of the kind of regulatory remit of the Gambling Commission, but I think are worth sharing nonetheless. And I think really pulling together the reflections that we had from participants, as well as the insights from regulatory and policy experts, people who are in the awareness raising and harm reduction space, we kind of netted out several areas. But I think there's one big overarching point here that really kind of stood out, and under which we kind of saw several recommendation areas sit underneath, and that was really that we saw this desire for young men and boys to I suppose just to be equipped adequately with the ability to kind of be aware and reflective about and reflective about their relationship or a potential relationship they might have with gambling, and I think under that we saw several things that might support that. One of which would be educating around kind of what early warning signs look like, so they can be easily spotted in themselves, in friends that they're close with. Warning signs being some of those indications of a perhaps a more damaging relationship or a more difficult, challenging relationship with gambling or gambling activity. A focus also, of course, on building financial literacy, the ability to make wise decisions with one's money, given I think this was felt in some cases, especially individuals who had higher levels of gambling activity, to be absent in some cases, in a sense that sometimes kind of the risk taking with money could go unchecked. But also, I think in line with that, building emotional literacy, the ability to recognize, understand, to express and manage, one's own emotions and those of, others close to them, more about identifying and observing changes in emotional states, given the observed emotional impact of gambling behaviours. And I think one particular point around the kind of reflexivity, I suppose, is being given some support around that and a bit more of a kind of a nudge. And I think many participants, especially if they were over the age of 18, and in the context, I think, of the constant visibility of gambling related content and promotion, I think being encouraged and advised to reflect before or soon or after the legal threshold at 18, given what Lauren was saying about it being this kind of really critical transitionary point. I think there's a perception that from participants, that they having these reflection points will help them in terms of kind of thinking about habit forming and thinking about making decisions that might lead to kind of stronger or more entrenched habits around gambling. And this feels very critical at a point when, you know, many young men have, you know, first gained independent access to regulated gambling. As Lauren said, they have maybe more, you know, more disposable income available, and they of course are legally able to gamble. And I think also there was a very interesting point around implementing a more kind of nuanced harm reduction approach, especially in kind of educational context. I think there's a perception perhaps that if there's conversation or around gambling that's coming from, you know, teachers, parents, etc., that maybe there's just it can be a little bit uniform and a little bit kind of reductive insofar as it can feel a little bit just like being told outright not to gamble, or maybe that there's just no conversation around it at all, which can be kind of maybe just as damaging, at least as some of our participants saw it. I think a need maybe for there to be a kind of a slightly more nuanced approach to acknowledge this is something that happens, this is something that's very commonplace. There can be kind of perceived benefits, but there can also be perceived kind of downsides, and it's being aware of all of those things, as well as kind of alongside building the emotional literacy, building the financial literacy, building the sense of kind of what early warning signs look like, and what, you know, potentially more where greater levels of harm can be incurred and experienced, and what that can look like as well. So yeah, a bit more of a nuanced picture, but I don't know if Lauren has got anything else to share around kind of some of those, you know, opportunity areas in the context of the Gambling Commission's work.
Yeah, so as George said, many of the findings and implications from this research do fall outside of our regulatory remit, and we will therefore be discussing the findings with other regulators such as Ofcom and the Advertising Standards Agency, who can build the findings into their work.
Yeah, it's really helpful. I think, Anna, you sort of leads on to that question around stigma, isn't it? And so it's young people's approach around stigma. I don't know if you want to. It's that one.
Yeah. I think it's just some reflections I've just had on that as well. I think that's a really important point around sort of the limitations of us as a regulator, and that might not be something that all listeners are aware of. So yeah, thanks for adding that detail and talking about the other regulators who have that space and that ability to regulate some of those areas. So yeah, in terms of young men and sort of the stigma around it, did you find that there was sort of a reticence to talk about this? Was there an element of feeling that they'd be stigmatized or viewed in a certain way if they expressed their views?
It's a really brilliant question, and I think one that kind of we were very mindful of the possibility of there being a kind of reluctance to be open to share candidly with us, even with the most kind of well thought out research approach that really strived to create comfort for participants. But I think we were maybe perhaps surprised, but kind of just really delighted to learn as we went through this research and we're having these interactions with participants that most were really open to discussing this. And I suppose we would like to think, and maybe justifiably, we can take some credit for this because of the really thoughtful, intentional research design that we developed with the Gambling Commission. You know, by which I mean, there's just, you know, a handful of examples, things like really transparently communicating the research objectives in really thoughtful, sensitive and accessible language to the participants, really treating participants as the experts of their own experiences and saying, your input is incredibly valuable here, and this is what it's helping to kind of inform and shape. So you can kind of have a say in something that's really, really valuable here. And ultimately, I think ensuring that they felt in control of what they did and didn't share, you know, there being no obligation, as is kind of required of running ethical qualitative research. There is no mandate for participants to share anything, to answer any of our questions, but just giving them that kind of that position to answer what they feel comfortable answering. And often that means that people just kind of do open up more because they know that they don't have to answer, you know, every single question we put to them. That being said, though, yeah, of course, there was this element of surprise. But I think we observed, and actually participants would say themselves, because a big part of the research was, or, you know, a big part, well, I suppose big insofar as it was a nice, significant learning for us, but a small component of the research was giving space to participants to talk about how they found the experience and what they might have learned. And I think we saw through that process that, you know, this research really kind of I think because it encouraged them to consider their relationship to something that was maybe really familiar to them, but they had not reflected upon, as I was talking about at the start of this conversation. The exercise, getting them to kind of think about gambling, think about their behaviors, it really prompted curiosity. And I think then that led to a kind of keenness to say, oh, wait, I found this really interesting about myself. I'd like to share this with you. And you seem interested because you're asking questions about this. So there was this kind of, let's share honestly. And I think also just this point around, I think, which we see quite a lot with young men and boys, which is that there aren't always spaces for them to share candidly. So often the social conversation centers on stuff that's much more kind of positive in tone. It can feel like bantering or jokiness. And I think, there is a real positive side of gambling, but I think for some participants, they really relished the opportunity to kind of just talk a bit more openly and candidly about some of their experiences, some positive, some negative, rather than it just being the kind of the familiar conversation they might have with friends around gambling, which is much more positively framed, even if that might not be how they feel. Now, of course, we would stress we are not therapists here, we are not counselors. So there's a limit to kind of the what we can offer in those moments. But I think just in terms of being researchers and being able to hold a space to talk about some of these things, and then of course where relevant signpost accordingly, but being able to give these young men, boys a space to talk about what they might have been experiencing was really valuable for them. And I think it prompted the kind of increasing openness. And I think we even observed that maybe even more surprisingly with the participants who we were expecting to be even more reluctant to share. Those who were gambling more frequently with higher amounts, who had greater experience of harms, a real sense of kind of openness. Sometimes, though, and I think this is very intriguing and certainly worth kind of looking at in the report, partly informed sometimes, though, by a sense of kind of that they were in control around their gambling activity, a perception that they had a kind of higher likelihood of winning, but also being able to kind of pull themselves out of the relationship with gambling, which in many cases we observed to be, a credible kind of perception to have, that they would be able to do that. In some cases, maybe slightly less so. But also a kind of a perception that they were able to kind of keep the activity within acceptable levels for them. So I think because of that, they didn't feel kind of maybe shame around some of the more difficult experiences they might have had, because they knew that, okay, well, I've got things within control. I've got a certain level of spend and frequency. And again, I think interestingly worth looking at in the report, but this really derives from that kind of perception of the activity that they were doing being maybe more skill based than luck based. So because there was more of their kind of intelligence and input into the outcome, a sense that they were more likely to secure wins. So a slightly kind of tangential point there, but I think definitely kind of connects up to some of the interesting perceptions around control and around skill and how that informs how people think about their relationship to gambling, but then also feeds into how kind of comfortable they were sharing with us. But yeah, we were generally pretty surprised, but kind of delighted by the openness we saw. Sadly, though, I think, it'd be nice to be able to say, this represents a kind of significant departure from what we've seen with other generations, or it's a big generational shift. They're much more open. We wouldn't be able to comment on that, but we certainly did observe an openness in this generation.
Yeah, I think there's a follow-up there, maybe from you, Haroon, around vulnerability and whether there's certain individuals.
Yeah, we've looked at 11 to 17-year-olds in the past, and Lauren's mentioned that, and you look at the journey that, the key points that a young person has as they go through that journey, and obviously we've looked at beyond that in terms of 18 plus. Are there particular individuals or sort of groups within that journey in terms of age range that has a sort of vulnerability, or areas that you think, that we really had to sort of take a closer look at this particular moment, because it felt like that was an opportunity that we probably need to delve into a bit more, more detail to understand a little bit further, because everyone has a different journey, and expose themselves in different ways to gambling behaviours or types of gambling. But are there particular moments within that sort of journey from 11 to 18 and then beyond that you're okay with? There's clearly an opportunity there for us to tackle some of the vulnerabilities or to support those people.
It's a really great question, Haroon. I think the first thing to say is that when we were looking at participants' kind of reported pathways, it was clear that that risk really is cumulative. It doesn't occur after a single kind of gambling event per se. I think, yes, maybe some participants are kind of maybe more likely to follow for their gambling behaviors to become a little bit more entrenched, more regular, if they have a very positive experience with gambling initially. And that's especially the case if they're around or over the age of 18, and they've experienced, a betting app, for example, and generated a significant return on, say, an initial bet. But I think it's worth saying, though, if we're looking at kind of heightened levels of vulnerability or moments that feel like there is more intense sense of vulnerability, that really is around some of those, that I suppose, kind of key life transitions, which tends to kind of map to 18 years of age and upwards, that move into kind of legal adulthood, so to speak, paid work, going to university. These factors often tend to kind of converge to create a sense of an heightened vulnerability. As Lauren was alluding to with regards to kind of the transition at 18, it does feel very significant there. So that's a particular area, kind of, which I suppose we kind of hypothesize would be, but it's very helpful, I think, to go through this research to have that evidenced. Worth also saying that for a minority, and importantly a minority, but nonetheless some of our participants, there's the kind of financial frame, but it exists alongside some of these emotional drivers. For a small group, we saw that they were using gambling as a way to manage stress, or even just to kind of fill time, which I think in turn could nudge the frequency upwards. If stress levels increased, if they found that they were experiencing boredom more regularly, this tendency to maybe gamble more was something that we observed, and they stated, and when they were reporting their behaviors, which I think really suggests that a pattern can emerge. Gambling can shift from a planned leisure activity to an emotional outlet, and that pattern can may increase vulnerability over time. So something to kind of be mindful of, and again, I think points to the importance of young men and boys being equipped with the tools to be self-aware and be able to kind of take appropriate action where they feel like that vulnerability may be increasing.
I think that's bringing us towards the end of our questions, I suppose. So in order to sum up, I suppose we'll go to George first and then to Lauren. I think so. George, now that the research is out there, and obviously you touched on so many parts of it, now reflecting back on all that you've spoken about, what do you see as sort of the natural next step of this? Because there's a hell of a lot to digest and understand. Obviously there's recommendations and thoughts and what could happen or should happen or can happen, sort of thing. But from your point of view, what makes sense in terms of next steps?
Yeah, it's a really kind of exciting question, actually, Haroon, and one that we've mulled over a fair bit with Lauren and the team. I think there's a couple of areas. I think for us, research that could really track how young men and teenage boys' kind of understanding of harm, of control, of reward changes, kind of sustains or persists as they transition, from and through adolescence into adulthood. In a kind of what we might call, in terms of research terms, a kind of a longitudinal study. So being able to really, over a long period of time, be with these participants and understand these changes kind of as they're happening in real time. We had the benefit, of course, of working with participants in this research for them to reflect back and look back at their own experiences, which I think has its own merits, because they have the benefit of kind of hindsight and looking backwards to be able to reflect on kind of the journey that they've been on, which I think can be really valuable. But of course, we know that, memory isn't always super reliable, though generally speaking it is. I think the most important things do come to the surface, but I think it would be really helpful to have that real-time indication of how things are, what they're like, and then being able to look at and see how the transitions take place. The other area that I've alluded to already around gambling literacy that we would like to dig into is really understanding how that develops among young people, including how they kind of interpret risk, probability, odds, and to kind of really dig into the effectiveness of some of the interventions that maybe make those concepts a bit easier to understand and to instruct kind of gambling behavior as a result of that. And as I've mentioned, of course, that'd be a really nice complement to the ongoing research from consumer comprehension. So those are the kind of the two big areas that we feel like could benefit from future research.
And I suppose to finish with then, Lauren, and now that we've had the opportunity to sort of look into the research and understand a little bit more with this demographic and fill in some of those existing sort of knowledge gaps, what are the natural next steps for the GC? And I know we've got our evidence and priorities work out there where some people sits quite prominently in that work. What is the natural next phase now towards?
I think building on what George said, what we lack at the moment is really tracking the sane participants over time and through that transition period of teenager to 18 and beyond. So that would be our next step.
I suppose to finish then, the research is out there, so people can download that and have a look at that, and there will be more sort of snippets that come out off the back of that. But I should thank Lauren and George today for taking the time out to speak to us.
Thanks
so much.
This is Inside the Commission, a Gambling Commission podcast. To stay up to date with the latest content, you can subscribe to our Gambling Commission YouTube channel, or you can find us on your preferred platform, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks for listening.